Hello everyone, and welcome to our presentation, What Does the Global Agricultural Trade Landscape Look Like? Our presenter today is Kari Hierman. Kari is a research agricultural economist in the International Demand and Trade Branch at the Economic Research Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Kari's research focuses on modeling international trade in food and agriculture system and on integrating key features of modern global agricultural markets into analytical tools. Kari received her PhD from the University of Minnesota in 2013. Kari, welcome.
Thank you. This is Kari Hierman from the Economic Research Service, and today I'm going to talk about the global landscape of agricultural trade. The first thing to note is that agricultural trade has expanded tremendously over the past 20 years. The blue line in this graph shows that the value of agricultural trade has about tripled since 1995. The orange line shows that even if we take out the effect of generally rising prices for agricultural products, the value or the amount of agricultural trade has about doubled since that time. My presentation today is going to cover both trade patterns and trade policy. Overall, the trends that we saw in the previous slide illustrates the growing importance of trade for agriculture, but it hides substantial shifts in the patterns of trade and the policies that influence them that have occurred over the past 20 years. Today I'm going to talk about how trade and trade policy have evolved and contributed to the environment in which U.S. agricultural exporters conduct business today. Like global agricultural exports, U.S. agricultural exports have risen steadily over the past 20 years. But the share of the U.S. in total global agricultural exports has declined as competition has become more intense. Much of the increase in that competition has come from countries in the developing world, but that increase has also been accompanied by an increase in demand from these countries, making them more valuable markets for U.S. agricultural exports. 5 countries are particularly emblematic of these shifts. Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, and China are referred to as the BRICS countries, and they're both increasingly valuable markets for agricultural products and increasingly important competitors for U.S. agricultural producers. The trade increase illustrated in the previous slide has been facilitated by economic growth around the world, as well as advances in communication, information, and transportation technology that have shaped the global economy over the past 20 years in general. There have also been changes in trade policy, including free trade agreements, but tariffs continue to restrict trade on key agricultural products. In addition, major emerging countries have increased the amount of financial support they provide to their farmers that can provide an extra advantage to those producers in international trade. In addition, there's been an increase in the use of government regulations as barriers to agricultural trade. We'll talk about all of these issues. This chart illustrates how the major destinations for U.S. agricultural exports have changed over the past 20 years. The pie on the left-hand side is the breakdown of U.S. agricultural exports by region on average between 1995 to 1995. The pie on the right-hand side is the same for the years 2011 to 2015. The most important thing to note is that U.S. agricultural exports have changed such that North America and developing Asia have become more important destinations for U.S. agricultural exports, while the European Union and Japan have been less important on average. The blue bars in this next slide illustrate the general increase in U.S. agricultural exports over the past 20 years as global demand for agricultural products has increased. The orange line shows the falling U.S. share of global agricultural exports from about plus or minus 20% at the beginning of the period to plus or minus 15% at the end as competition intensified. This chart reveals the source of the increasing competition for U.S. agricultural exports. The pie on the left-hand side breaks down global agricultural export value on average from 1995 to 1999. The pie on the right-hand side breaks down global agricultural exports value on average from 2010 to 2014. What's notable here is the increase in the share of global agricultural exports represented by the BRICS countries, rising from 14% of total agricultural exports to 23%, and the decline, on the other hand, of the share represented by the European Union and also Japan. Despite the fact that North America and Western Europe have lost some of their share of global agricultural exports, the US and EU remain the largest global exporters by value by a relatively substantial margin. This next chart illustrates the sources of the growing markets for agricultural exports on the other hand. The left-hand pie shows a breakdown of global agricultural imports value by region on average from 1995 to 1999. During this time period, the US, Japan, and the European Union were the destination for more than half of all global agricultural exports. The right-hand pie shows the average breakdown of global agricultural import value from 2010 to 2014. And as you can see, just like in the previous slide, the share represented by the BRICS countries expanded significantly, especially China in this case, rising from 3% of global agricultural imports to 10% of global agricultural imports over that 20-year period. On the other hand, the shares of the EU and Japan have declined substantially. The previous several slides have been intended to give you a glimpse of the major trends in global agricultural trade and the broad economic forces driving them. In the next few slides, I will go through some of the government policies that influence these patterns and talk about how they have evolved to characterize the current global trading environment. I'm going to touch on some key concepts in agricultural trade, including some technical but important aspects for watchers of global agricultural trade policy. So first, one of the factors driving the increase in trade over time has been an expansion of free trade agreements as countries lower their tariffs to try to expand markets for their exporters. This chart shows the number of free trade agreements that several countries participate in. The blue bars are the total number of free trade agreements. The orange bars are the recent trade agreements since 2010. The EU has the largest number of total free trade agreements, but it's important to know that this number includes the agreements made to expand the European Union since 1995. China and Korea plus the EU have been the most active in recent years, but noticeably the 5 BRICS countries in general have not been among the most highly active. Particularly Brazil has very few free trade agreements. The rise in free trade agreements does not directly translate to more free trade in agriculture. Many agreements will boast that they have eliminated tariffs in something 95% of all products. But that 5% is often many, many agricultural products. And these agricultural products are often products where there's a large potential for rising trade, but for which domestic producers are able to argue that they need continued protection even after the free trade agreement comes into effect. A common tool to limit expansion is a tariff rate quota, and I'll come back to what these tariff rate quotas are later. This chart confirms that agricultural tariffs remain high on average despite the rise of free trade agreements. This chart has the average tariff charged on agricultural products entering several markets. These tariffs range from an average of almost 60% in Egypt down to very low tariffs offered by the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Singapore. These tariffs that are actually charged charged on agricultural products are referred to as applied tariffs. And we distinguish applied tariffs because an important concern for exporters is that countries maintain the ability to increase agricultural tariffs despite the agreements they've entered into. Members of the World Trade Organization in particular have mutually agreed through negotiations to a set of maximum tariffs on agricultural products. And each country has their own set of maximum tariffs referred to as their tariff schedule. And these tariffs, these agreed maximums, are called the bound tariffs. And applied tariffs are typically lower, but this difference between the applied and bound tariffs gives countries some leeway to increase protection at any time. And that ability to increase protection is a concern, as well as the actual level of the tariff. The average tariffs in the previous slide disguise a tremendous amount of variation, with some agricultural products, many agricultural products having very low tariffs, but a few agricultural products face tariffs well above the average. And these very high tariffs are referred to as peak tariffs. They can be as much as 1,000%. The table below shows countries that apply very high peak tariffs. The peak tariffs usually apply to politically sensitive products. And these are products in which the government wishes to protect domestic producers or processors from global competition, or constrain domestic consumption in some way. Many Asian countries have very high peak tariffs on rice. In the US, there's a very high tariff on a certain type of manufactured tobacco product. This table illustrates how widespread protection for sensitive products can be. Sensitive products exist in many different subsectors of the agricultural sector. A common approach to limiting access for a sensitive product in a free trade agreement is to apply something called a tariff rate quota. And what a tariff rate quota is, an agreement that for a certain amount of a given product, the importing country will apply a low tariff, the in-quota tariff that's called, but after a certain amount of the product has entered the market, the much higher out-of-quota tariff will be applied. So it's sort of a two-level tariff, with low tariffs for some amount and high tariffs for the rest. This table lists some key US and EU free trade agreements, and it shows the product categories in which free trade has been limited in these agreements by a tariff rate quota. The T symbols that dominate the US agreements indicate cases where TRQs are eventually ended or phased out, so they really serve as a transition to free trade in these products. The X's that dominate the EU agreements are permanent limits on free trade. They're permanent TRQs. Beyond border protections such as tariffs and TRQs and other instruments, there are a number of other government policies that affect trade, either through affecting international prices or quantities. One such type of policy is domestic farm support policies. These policies can offer the kind of help to farmers that gives them an extra advantage in global trade. And members of the WTO have agreed to some ground rules that are intended to limit the amount of money spent on the type of policies that gives countries extra advantages. Those are referred to as trade distorting domestic support policies. But these rules were established in 1995, and much has changed since then. The graph on the left-hand side shows the evolution of a measure of total spending on farm support over time. The most dramatic thing to note from here is the light blue line that shows a large increase in the spending on farm support programs in China over the past 7 years. The table on the right-hand side puts this into some perspective. It compares farm support as a share of total gross farm revenue in 1995 to 2015. China's rise is again visible here, but it's put into some perspective as the value of agricultural production in China has also increased over time. The other thing you can notice from here is that like China, Indonesia has also increased its spending on agricultural support. The share of its spending in gross farm revenue has increased even more than has China's. What's also visible here is that the EU and Japan have both decreased their producer support as a share of gross farm revenue over this 20-year period. Agricultural products are also subject to a number and an increasing number of domestic regulations. These are especially regulations intended to preserve food safety and limit the spread of animal and plant diseases. These types of regulations are called sanitary and phytosanitary measures by trade economists. And these are critically important, even if they limit trade. It is absolutely important for countries to have the ability to impose regulations that protect the safety of the food supply and the value of the agricultural sector. However, they are often used to effectively protect domestic producers in cases where there really is no risk to food safety or animal and plant health. Members of the WTO have agreed to some practices in designing domestic regulations so that they can prevent them being used as trade barriers without the presence of a real risk to health and safety. When one member thinks another's regulations are being used to limit trade without justification, they often begin to try to resolve the problem by formally stating in a regular meeting their concern with a particular policy. These are referred to as specific trade concerns. This chart counts up all of the specific trade concerns on agricultural, sanitary, and phytosanitary measures from 1995 to 2005, and that is meant to sort of illustrate where the types of sanitary and phytosanitary regulations are being used as trade barriers and which countries are most often accused of using them. What you can see here is the most common subject of concern for exporters is with respect to countries' regulations on animal disease, unfairly restricting trade. The most common target for concern about domestic regulations acting as barriers to agricultural trade is the European Union. And the most frequent concern is with the set of policies that they use on their rules on the presence of substances they would like to prohibit. This includes, for example, restrictions on the presence of genetically engineered varieties of some crops. So in this last slide, I'll illustrate the fact that trade barriers can combine with each other to effectively shut down trade. In some cases, products face not only a high tariff, but also face costly regulatory barriers and other barriers as well. This table shows the example of U.S. poultry meat exports. It lists the 15 most populous countries in the world. Their 2015 imports of U.S. poultry meat, the tariff rate charged, and other barriers faced by U.S. poultry. Notice that of the 5 largest countries, U.S. agricultural or U.S. exports of poultry meat are very small. In fact, the largest importer among these top 5 countries, the European Union 28, the exports are largely to U.S. military bases. The countries where more U.S. agricultural or U.S. poultry meat exports go to, like Mexico and Vietnam, face much lower barriers. So you can see the effectiveness, particularly of these barriers beyond tariffs alone, in restricting U.S. agricultural trade. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Kari. If you'd like more information on agricultural trade, you can go to the ERS website at www.ers.usda.gov. You also may be interested in a recent ERS report The Global Landscape of Agricultural Trade, 1995 to 2014. This report covers 20 years of trends in world agricultural trade and summarizes key policy issues that will confront decision makers and shape agricultural trade in the coming years. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for watching and have a great day.